Okay, well, I guess we are starting a bit early. So thank you everybody who is tuning in online now that we are completely online to our event by the UBC Students for Freedom of Expression called What's the Deal with White Women? Today we will be discussing the phenomenon of white women being offended on behalf of minorities and why this is so prominent in the current time. Today joining us, we have Dr. Warren Farrell and Dr. Janice Fiamengo to speak with us about this issue. Dr. Farrell will be beginning. We going to ask questions regarding his book, and then we'll move on to a general question period. So for a quick introduction, Dr. Warren Farrell has been chosen by the Financial Times as one of the world's top 100 thought leaders. His books are published in over 50 countries and in 19 languages. They include the New York Times bestseller, Why Men Are the Way They Are, plus the international bestseller, The Myth of Male Power. His most recent is The Boy Crisis, we have right here. It was chosen as a finalist for the Forward Indies Award. Dr. Farrell has been a pioneer in both the women's movement and is called by GQ magazine the Martin Luther King of the men's movement. He conducts couples communication workshops nationwide. He has appeared on over 1,000 television shows and has been interviewed by Oprah, Barbara Walters, Peter Jennings, Katie Couric, Larry King, Tucker Carlson, Regis Philbin, and Charlie Rose. He's frequently written for and been featured in the New York Times and publications worldwide. Dr. Farrell has 2 daughters, lives with his wife in Mill Valley, California. All right. We will introduce Dr. Fiamengo before her segment, just so nobody forgets in the interim. Okay, so I will begin. I have some questions prepared for Dr. Farrell. So just to begin, is the hypersensitivity often seen in white women, could it be seen as a product of the boy crisis?
I don't think so. I think the sensitivity in white women really came from the greater likelihood that white women were leaders in the beginnings of the feminist movement, and that feminism, and in fact, a large number of African American women complained about that at the beginning of the feminist movement, that that the white women were taking leadership roles. But in fact, leaderships in revolutions or evolutions are almost always a product of luxury. The luxury of being able to have enough money to survive, and then after that survival, you are able to go up the Maslow's hierarchy of values and be able to have other opportunities that are not survival dependent. And there was more likely that white women were in positions of middle or upper middle class, and ironically, sometimes among the in the early feminists that I was that I spent a lot of time with. Some of them were being supported by husbands who had a fair amount of, who were, creating a fair amount of opportunity for them that gave them the freedom to be able to go out and be leaders in these issues. And we as feminists, I say we as feminists because I was, as you mentioned in the introduction, I was in the board of directors of the National Organization for Women in New York City, and was very deeply involved, speaking all around the world on behalf of the feminist movement, maybe the token male feminist, if you will. And in the process, there was a great deal of negative energy about the family and about mostly about the nuclear family. There was we all evolved out of the civil rights movement, in which there was the oppressor and the oppressed. And then we moved to gay movements, in which gay people were clearly marginalized. And we moved to Marx, and then early feminists. A large number of the leaders were socialist in their orientation, and they were oriented. They were very much tuned in with Marxism and Leninism. And Lenin was very critical of the nuclear family. Said it was a patriarchal institution that was designed to oppress women. And so we all sort of grew up with this sort of like, we were in the era of hierarchies of oppressors and oppressed. And so the feminist movement said, okay, men are making more money than women are. And instead of saying, well, actually, it isn't men making more money than women per se for the same jobs and for 25 other variables that I've measured, but it is rather it is rather dads that are making more money than moms, and dads are making more money than moms, particularly because they have more pressure on them to give up jobs that are very fulfilling to them, that pay less because they are fulfilling. Jobs that are fulfilling pay less because there's lots of competition for those jobs, and so the supply and demand allows those jobs to pay less. And so dads gave up those jobs when they became fathers. Instead of becoming a musician or an elementary school teacher, they said, I can't afford to support both myself and my wife and 1, 2, 3, or 4 children and move into buy a home in a good school district so that the children can have the best schooling possible and that they can have more options than I've got to stop being self-centered, and I've got to give up my musician gig or whatever and go into, instead of being a starving artist, being somebody who produces more money for the family to give them more options. And so we, instead of saying, thank you, moms, for risking your life in childbirth and giving up your careers possibilities to raise children, and dads, thank you for making not sacrifices of careers, but sacrifices in your careers, or giving up opportunities to enjoy yourself and fulfill yourself, and sell product X nationwide so that your children could have more money. Thank you, Dad, for making that sacrifice, and thank you, Mom, for making that sacrifice. That would have been great. But instead we said, aha, men are making more money than women are. That shows you that that women are oppressed. And in fact, what was really happening is that the world was not dominated by a patriarchy. It was men that made rules to benefit men at the expense of women. It was dominated by the need to survive. And to survive, both men and women made sacrifices. Women largely at home and men largely at work. And the good news was that we credited women with their sacrifices. The bad news was that we suggested that men's sacrifices were, in fact, male entitlement, male privilege. If we really wanted male entitlement and male privilege, we would reverse the roles for the next 1,000 years and have a special affirmative action program where only women went to war and men stayed home and got protected and were entitled to love and be loved rather than kill and be killed. That would be entitlement. That and I think there are very few feminists. In fact, when there's still in the United States male-only draft registration. So at the age of 18, if you don't register for the draft, you have a $250,000 fine, 2 or 3 years in prison. In 42 states, your driver's license is taken away. You can never work for anything to do with the federal government. You can't go to schools that get federal aid, which is virtually every school, including private schools. And all of those things are taken away from you if you don't register for the draft as a male. If you don't register for a draft as a female, nothing is taken away from you. And there's not a single feminist organization that I'm aware of that has said that is unequal. Because we care about equality, we must speak up about this because otherwise we would be hypocrites. What has happened is they have been otherwise hypocrites.
Okay, thank you for your answer. Actually surprised me. I thought you would say something else, but
well, what did you think I would say?
I don't know. I thought that you would say that yes, it is a product of the boy crisis, because it seems like from your book, like everything's pretty interconnected with all of society and the ramifications of like father under involvement and like not appreciating men. I actually did have a good conversation with my dad as a result of your book when I asked him about the glint in his eye. So that was really nice.
Would you share what I do about that, and then would you share what your dad said?
Yeah, well, he said that he always was interested in my dad's a doctor, and so he was always interested in pursuing school, and like his sense of worth always came from getting good grades, but he really enjoyed art and clarinet. So he's actually started drawing a lot more now, and he's picked up his clarinet after like 5 years of not playing. So
wow. And
yeah.
Was him picking up his clarinet have anything to do with your conversation with him about the glint in his eye?
I think so. I kind of encouraged him to play again because I told him how when I was a kid, I remember him playing it. And after my parents got divorced, I didn't really see him play it. So I think knowing that I cared, that he was happy, maybe kind of sparked something. I'm not sure.
Oh, I'm really happy to hear that. My dad was, when I first started writing, my dad said to me, okay, Warren, I can see you're interested in writing, but you got to do all your work and your jobs first. And by the way, Warren, do you realize that only 1 out of 100 people who write books even get their book published? And if you can't find a publisher, you'll never find a wife. And so just warning you, Warren. And then he said, and by the way, of the people who do get published, the average author makes only about $5,000 for their book in their lifetime. And so that's not enough to support a family on. That's because from his perspective in those days, supporting a family was what you did. And so years later, when I did do okay, with being an author, he did acknowledge that, but he also said, one day he visited me in California when I first moved to California. And he said, he was talking about himself for about 3 days. I finally gently said to Dad, for the past 3 days that you've been here, you've always talked about yourself, but you've never asked me anything about how I'm doing. Long pause. He said, well, I want to keep our relationship positive. And I said, not asking me anything about me is not keeping a relationship positive. It's not even a relationship. What's going on? Long pause. And he said, well, I think the work you're doing is ruining the lives of millions of people. And I said, well, thank you for thinking I affect millions of people, but why ruining the lives part? And he said, because you're teaching people psychology, and psychology teaches people to do what they want to do, not what they have to do. Being a man is learning to do what you have to do, what your responsibilities are, what you need to do. And you've been lucky enough to be able to make a living from writing. The people you're teaching, 99% of them may not be lucky enough. And you're encouraging them to pursue their desires and to think for themselves and be in touch with their feelings. I think all that's just great stuff, but it's really dangerous stuff too. And that's why I fear that you may be ruining the lives of millions of people. So at that point in time, I felt just really hurt and went home and cried. And a month or so later, after I thought about it, I came back to my dad and I said, Dad, your generation has been a generation that has really succeeded enough in the middle and upper middle classes that it's freed people like me and other sons and daughters to be able to do things that we really want to do, not just what we have to do. So the type of people who come to my workshops probably mostly have enough income to be able to do what they really want to do, or at least consider that as an option, or at least consider the trade-offs. And so I just want you to acknowledge yourself and your generation for making those sacrifices that created this freedom and this opportunity for me to go beyond just playing a role. And that really helped. I hope you've done a little bit of that with your dad in terms of, and for the people who are just tuning in here, one of the when I wrote The Boy Crisis, I talked about it in the book, the fact that I do workshops in which, and one of the exercises I ask people in the workshops to do is to imagine the glint in your father's eye, and I take them through a whole journey of how to detect that glint in your father's eye. And then compare what that glint was. Like maybe he loves playing with your children, maybe he loved art, playing the clarinet, music, writing, had a dream like that, and he was really happy about that. Maybe you saw that glint in the early years, and you saw it in the pictures of your father with your mother and in their honeymoon, and then to ask your father what was the glint in his eye, and then ask yourself, what is he doing now? And what he is doing now, maybe selling products X around the country, is that what he identified as the glint in his eye? In your dad's case, Lillian, playing the clarinet, is that what your dad is doing now? And the chances are the answer is no. And why is the answer no? Not because men are entitled and men have privilege and men have power, but because they learned that when they had Lillian, the clarinet was less important than Lillian was.
Yeah, we'll move on to the next question. Thank you. So I have a lot here. But in The Boy Crisis, you talked about men joining white supremacist groups as a result of lack of emotional intelligence. What would be the equivalent of what women do as a result of lack of emotional intelligence?
Well, for example, in the women's movement, one of the so-called leaders was Valerie Solanas. She wrote a book called The Scum Manifesto, The Society for Cutting Up Men. She didn't just write that book. That was not put down by feminist leaders. And as I said at that time, I knew pretty much every feminist leader, and they did not put it down. And in addition to that, Valerie Solanas didn't just write a book in theory. She shot Andy Warhol. That basically killed his productive career. It didn't kill him physically, but it killed his productive career. And so the end in a movie I watched about the feminist movement, and Valerie Solanas was interviewed about Andy Warhol, and as an expert on Andy Warhol, even after she had shot and almost killed him. And there was not a negative introduction about her. There was an expertise type introduction about her. And so that is an example of, I'd say, not only a lack of emotional intelligence, but where that lack of emotional intelligence led. And I care less about her doing that than I care about the reaction, the unwillingness of our feminist leadership, many of whom had extremely bright and extremely thoughtful, that did not put her down, that did not make it clear that was not an acceptable way to wind yourself into leadership and notability, no less notoriety.
Wow. Okay. I was not aware of that. That's interesting. I'll look more into that. Let's see. Okay. So this phenomenon of white women being offended on behalf of minorities, what part of this phenomenon do you believe comes from the white aspect of the identity, and which do you believe is from the female aspect?
Well, I think we have a challenging history here and a challenging biology. Throughout all of biology and almost all animal species and even insects that are technically considered animals, the female has sex, procreates, creating the next generation with the alpha male. And so in order to become that alpha, so the female grows up with an expectation of being protected by male disposability. Now, what I mean by male disposability is that every generation has had its war. And in every generation, we've said to men, step up and be a man and be willing to be disposable in that war. Among animals, we have the same type of thing. So, for example, with buck elks, about 85% of female buck elks that mate with that alpha male. The alpha male is the one that has the biggest rack. What it takes to get that biggest rack is an exhaustion of 30% of the minerals and the calcium and the nutrients of the buck elk. So therefore, if the buck elk does not get rid of that rack immediately after the procreation activity, they are likely to die before the winter sets in and they can't replenish their nutrients. So that's a perfect example of men's weakness being their facade of strength. And so, and what we in the feminist movement did is we started taking the facade of strength literally without seeing the weakness behind it. And we started calling it privilege and entitlement rather than this is the men competing with each other to sacrifice their lives to be our biggest protectors so that we can have children and be able to be free to love those children and be loved by those children, while the men went off oftentimes and died in the process of protecting us. And so the feminist movement blocked out female entitlement and took male sacrifice and called it male entitlement. And that has left a generation of men feeling very misunderstood. And I don't want you to get me wrong here. we've had a battle of the sexes throughout all of human recorded history that I'm aware of. But the difference has been that in the last half century, there hasn't been a battle of the sexes. There's been a war in which only one side has shown up, and men have put their heads in the sand and hoped the bullets would miss. And so what Janice and I are doing now is saying, women can't hear what men don't say. It is your obligation to speak up because you are being discarded. You're feeling a lack of purpose. This is not healthy for you. It is not healthy for your children. And it's not healthy for women to feel men who are rudderless and without purpose. We're all in the same family boat. When we paint a picture in which only one sex wins, both sexes end up losing.
Okay, thank you. Okay. The next question kind of adds on to that one. So personally, the women I've seen most exhibiting these behaviors, on top of being white, are usually affluent, and many of them don't have children. In the boy crisis, you discussed how purpose void affects men. How does a purpose void such as this affect women?
Well, women, really good question. Women get their sense of purpose by saying, okay, I can be part of the women's movement. And the 99% of people, men and women, don't think a lot about these things. If something is if you've gone to a women's studies, gender studies class, which is really a women's studies class, you learn that men are the oppressors and women are the oppressed, and men occupy the top levels of jobs. And you don't learn anything about the fact that 49% of men, according to the Pew Research Center, when asked if they would prefer to be full-time dads or full-time workers, 49% of men say I would prefer to be full-time dads. No feminist ever talks about that when a middle or upper middle class couple, when the female is pregnant, the woman starts thinking to herself and talking to her friends and family and at dinner tables and says, well, I have three choices here. Number one is I can work full-time. Number two is I can be full-time involved with the children. Number three, I can do some combination of both. And 40% of women do work full-time. 40% raise their children full-time. 20% do part-time jobs after as they're raising their children in the first 5 years of life. And the men say, well, I have three options too. Option one is I can work full-time. Option two is I can work full-time, and option three is I can work full-time. Or if he's a working class person, I can work two jobs. If he's a top executive, a white collar worker, he will work overtime or longer or more hours. And so there's not we didn't put our fingers on the fact that men working longer and harder, like we've been talking about, in order to support the family, that was not about male privilege. We took a totally different attitude toward it. I think I have veered off of your question a little bit, Lillian. Ask that. Let me make sure that I got the answer correct on that.
I think you kind of covered it, just how the purpose void affects women now.
Oh, okay. So yeah, actually, I missed a part of that, which is the purpose void part. So women who don't have that sense of purpose built in, like raising children, oftentimes seek a different purpose. One of those purposes was the women's movement and being a champion of the underprivileged, and feeling that they that in their generation they're going to make it better for their daughters. But the framework that the women's movement has set up of not only are we going to make it better for our daughters, but the way we are going to make it better for our daughters is to fight a battle in the easiest way. The easiest way to fight any battle is to make another group the enemy and coalesce people around your need to defeat the enemy. And so what we in the feminist movement did is turned men into the enemy, as opposed to recognizing that men and I want to give credit to Betty Friedan, because in the book called The Second Stage, evolving from Betty Friedan's own vision and many I think conversations that we had, said that the second stage of the women's movement must be not a woman's movement, but a men's movement, because if it doesn't become a men's movement. We won't have men being in the home to the same degree as women are in the home, and women will be caught in this juggling act, in this quandary between do I work full time, with the children full time, or some combination of both. So we have to encourage women to fall in love with men who are nurturing, caring communicators, and what I call nurturer connectors, rather than just the provider protectors. And so if the woman wants to be the provider for the family, she can be a have-it-all woman. She can go out and be the provider for the family, and she can come home to a man who's taking care of the children full time. And but she must honor him and respect his decision, or her decision, to choose that type of man. But instead, what we did is we had a lot of the women who were feminists who didn't have children. They were marrying men who earned about as much money as they did or more, and they were leaving behind the nurturer connector type of men who might have allowed them to be a have-it-all woman. And then they were complaining that only men could be have-it-all men, that they couldn't be have-it-all women. The big problem that feminism has moved to today is, at the beginning, it was Helen Reddy singing, "I am woman, I am strong." Today, it is almost always, "I am woman, I've been wronged." And when I was on early TV shows in the early years of the 1960s and 1970s, male chauvinists would debate me on those shows, and they would say, "You watch it, Dr. Farrell. When the women get in power, they're going to be victims." And I and every other feminist just tore them apart for that attitude toward women. And my goodness, these male chauvinist attitudes are being proven by, in almost every corporation. We have HR departments, and HR departments are almost exclusively women saying men did something wrong. And they not become HR, which would be human resources. They become HER. They become all about her. And then women complaining that men aren't involved. And you can watch some of the talks that I've done to places like Pacific Bell. Watch that talk on my YouTube channel, and you'll see a man finally speaking up at one of these meetings. And the women shot him down, right? Even though I've been talking about exactly that problem for the half hour before that, which just goes to show you the lack of influence I have. So.
Okay, so I think we're almost at the halfway point. So I'm going to open it up for some audience questions, unless you have anything else you really wanted to get out there.
I'd love to hear from the people who are listening.
Okay, let's see here. I'll just scroll up a bit. I'm just trying to find if there are any questions here that aren't jokes for right now.
That aren't jokes, did you say?
Yeah, a lot of them are a little questionable. We do get a lot of people just trying to disrupt our events.
Let's call it get attention by disrupting.
Yeah. We actually have a few people in person here. So I was just wondering, I'm just going to see if anyone in the house wants to ask a question.
And if you're able to, and they're okay with being visually available, that would be great.
Yes. All right. You're up.
Oh. So ask a question?
Yeah. Well, I curate them.
Can you say your first name so I can speak to you as a person rather than as a...
Hey, my name's Nick. I just had a question on, I want to ask a question to both of them.
That's fine.
But Janice hasn't spoken yet. Okay, all right, fair enough. I just wanted to address like the dichotomy of these new identities that white women have seemed to get like within the last couple of years. I know it's Karens and it's the woke white women. Are these two different types of white women real? Like, are they something that are an average, or are they a very, like, I mean, for Karens, I would imagine are a very loud minority. But what has happened that has changed society to the point where we address different subtypes of white women based on these strange archetypes. And are they real? Are they even real?
Well, good. I'll take a first stab at it, but Janice, I'd love to hear your thoughts on it as well. I think the woke women and the Karens have evolved more frequently as a result of the enormous permission that women have today to be able to say, to call men out that they're not getting what they want from, and that's as happened in Central Park, and has happened with Joe Biden, and whether it's true or not, there's and the real challenge in all this is I've now interviewed about 11 or 12 CEOs who are very strongly in favor of wanting to move women through the ranks as quickly as possible, not only because they tend to be politically correct, but also because they recognize that women can be very effective executives. But every single one of those 11 or 12 has said to me, Warren, I'm afraid to mentor women today, because if I do one thing wrong, if I think a woman has promise and she gets more involved with something else and she doesn't fulfill that promise, I'm afraid that I will be blamed for being anti-women. If I interview her in the office and I leave the door open, somebody may pick up a little bit of what I say and make it into something different from what I intended. If I close the door, it looks like I'm trying to be secretive. If I take her out of the office, we go to dinner, it looks like I'm dating her. No matter what way I move, I have a wife and children at home. I don't want to jeopardize my career and therefore their life for the possibility of promoting a woman. And so I feel like I'm caught between a rock and a hard place. And if in general atmosphere in the office, men, when we're with each other, if you and I are, if you came into my company and you and I were together and I say, oh, Nick, you're a friend of so-and-so, or you're the son of so-and-so, I bet you expect to get really far really fast. And you go back to me and say, well, we don't really need old farts like you around. And this would show that we have respect for each other because we're exchanging wood-covered put-downs, which means that we both recognize that the other one can be self-effacing and laugh. And so but if we do this with a woman, the woman is likely to report that to human resources, and that's likely to be the end of our career or a significant stepping stone down. And so those are some of the things I think that have created the atmosphere. We've had feminism honing victimhood as a fine art, which is not feminism as empowering women. It's feminism as setting an example of the potential power of victimhood, which is exactly the opposite of what every feminist should want. Janice?
No. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay. Well, I hate to jump in because I'm so interested in hearing what you have to say, Warren. But in fact, my entire talk is in a way an attempt to explain the Karen phenomenon. So I'll get into it more later when it's my turn to speak. But the thing that has so interested me ever since Karen became a thing in late May of this year, the thing that has interested me so much is that depending on, first of all, that Karen became this shorthand for the sort of woman that a lot of people, men and women, and from both the right and the left ends of the political spectrum, felt really comfortable attacking. And from some perspectives, I think Karen can be seen as a version of the woke white woman, annoying in her insistence that she knows better, that she wants to speak to the manager about some injustice. That's sort of the stereotype of the Karen. From the other side of the coin, one might say that the woke white woman is the woman who is determined not to be the Karen, because the Karen is also seen as the racist white woman, the white woman who is arrogant, who exercises her white privilege over less powerful people. And we've seen a whole plethora of articles written in various news magazines and online sites talking about how Karens, in other words, white women, can become better allies for people of color, and how Karens need to acknowledge their white privilege. So I think both the woke white woman and the Karen are, both of them I think are obviously stereotypes, but they represent different positions in this very uneasy conjunction of discourses about gender and race that are competing and jostling for dominance in the public sphere right now. And I'm going to try to get into that in a little bit more depth when I give my talk. But yeah, I think the Karen phenomenon is really fascinating in that sense.
Wow, I'm looking really forward to hearing more about that, Janice. That's very.
Maybe I'll ask a subsequent question after your talk. Okay.
That's very interesting. I really love the way you're breaking that down.
Josh, do you have a question?
Yeah, sure.
Do you want to come on camera and ask it?
Yeah, sure. Hi, my name's Yash.
Hey, Yash.
I had a question. You mentioned a second movement that was necessary, and kind of that would have to come after a women's movement that's happening now, a feminist movement. And I kind of agree with that. It's kind of like an equalization, maybe, of some overreaching damage that some certain feminist movement kind of aspects might have had on workplace and things like workplace culture, like you mentioned. So I just wanted to get your opinion on what you think this second movement would involve, and what specifically it would undo that the feminist movement or feminist movements have kind of accomplished in terms of its goals for women today.
Really important. So very good question. So larger picture first. So what I thought I was getting into when I got involved with the feminist movement was not a feminist movement per se, but rather a gender liberation movement in which both sexes were freed from the rigid roles of our past to have more flexible roles for our future. I wanted that for women. I wanted that for men. And so did Gloria Steinem. She used to say what we need is more women at work and more men at home. I agreed 100% with that. And Betty Friedan, the same type of thing that she saw it in stages. And so what would then a men's movement look like? First, by calling it men's rights, we don't allow ourselves into the picture for two reasons. Remember I said before that when we use the word man or men, adult men, they were supposed to die to protect us. It's impossible to have a great deal of empathy for someone that your survival was dependent upon their death. That is, the way women survived, the way children survived, the way the next generation survived was by a large number of 18, 19, 20-year-old males going off to die so we could survive. So now if you're a parent, it's hard to develop an emotional attachment to the male because you may lose him, because the very thing that you're doing to make him a man is making him potentially disposable. It's hard to be attached emotionally to somebody that's disposable. And so these are the underlying in-depth things. When I used to speak I spoke to this very big men's conference that was Robert Bly oriented. I said, this Robert Bly type of male, the mythopoetic male, the male that goes out and beats drums, you're the center, and this is in the 80s. You're the center of attention now. You're getting TV rounds, but the TV will only come out to pay attention to men drumming one time. The rest of the time, the issue is going to be if there is a men's movement, we're going to have to speak up about why is it not okay for women to share the responsibilities for taking the sexual initiatives, as opposed to blaming men when they do it too fast or calling them wimps when they do it too slow? Why is it not okay for men to be as likely to be to volunteer to say, I want to be a full-time dad, without a woman going back for without a woman not coming back at a party for a second drink? And so men feel that but men need to speak up about this, because the way that we have expressed our feelings is to not express our feelings. It's, every man who's successful learns that the way you become successful is to repress your feelings, not express your feelings. And so the first thing that we have to understand is that women can't hear what men don't say. And so men take responsibility, understand what your issues are. The first are not even getting in touch with what your issues are. Second, go to the works of Janice Fiamengo and myself and other people and find out what men's issues are. Look at how the family courts. If you want to be a full-time dad after a divorce, you're going to not have the right to children. You're going to have to fight for children. I get calls almost every day from fathers that have asked me to testify as an expert witness in court to help them be equally involved with their children. Well, those dads have usually spent 80 to 100,000 US dollars before they even get to me. And I charge a lot, and their lawyer charges a lot, and sometimes they have to pay the fee of the mother's lawyer. And so they have to be middle or upper middle class in order to be able to fight for their children. So that's leaving the children that need their dads the most, children in poor communities, without any possibility, those fathers without any possibilities of having involvement with those children. As Lillian started to say before, in the boy crisis, when I started to do the research on that book, I looked at 10 major causes of the boy crisis. I found that the single biggest cause by a long shot was dad deprivation. Dad deprivation leads to suicides, leads to the mass shooters, are almost all have two things in common. One being male, number two being dad deprived. ISIS recruits from the US, I don't know about the Canadian ISIS recruits, but they're about 90% male. But both the males and the females among ISIS recruits are dad deprived by about 85, 90%. Prisoners are 93% males in the United States. The prison population has increased 700% since the 1970s. And the 93% males are about 85, 90% dad deprived males. So the impact of dad deprivation on all the things we care about, it costs the United States well over $1 trillion per year to clean up the mess of dad deprivation. And so, the best way to keep a government small is to keep the government. The best way to keep the government not being involved is to get dads involved. That's just, by the way, one of a dozen or so very significant issues that boys and men need to go with. And one of the reasons I wrote The Boy Crisis, not the only reason, but is that when you talk about boys having challenges, you open up the hearts of the mothers of boys. When you talk about men having challenges, the women's hearts often close. It sounds like men are complaining and whining, and women do not fall in love with whining men. They fall in love with alpha men. And so it's very hard for them to hear that. So we need to focus on what boys are going through. Why did the suicide rate go from equal to girls at the age of 9 to twice that of girls between the ages of 10 and 14, to 4 times that of girls between the ages of 15 and 19, and to 5 times that of girls between the ages of 20 and 25? Why is male life expectancy going down? The only time in history, recorded history, that gender's life expectancy has gone down. Why is it that men's sperm count has been reduced by 50%? Why is it that the European study found that men's IQs had dropped 15%? If we care about women, we have to care about men. I have 2 daughters. I don't want I want my daughters to have men who are worthy of them in life, except the one who's married. Don't you get any ideas? But we have to realize that it's men's duty on behalf of their sons and daughters to speak up about what is happening inside of them. This is the evolutionary shift that needs to happen. And women who want a sense of purpose, who have the privilege to be able to afford a sense of purpose, study up about white men. We need women like Janice Fiamengo more than we need almost any other segment of the population, because now you have the most credibility on relationships of anyone in recent history.
Thanks. That went into a lot of detail.
I just gave you a superficial Reader's Digest answer. Thank you for asking a really good question. That's why you got a lot of detail.
Thanks for asking, Josh.
Sure, thanks.
All right, so I've curated some good questions from the audience here. So Eduardo asks, is there a problem, or how should we solve the problem of the lack of women in science? Does machismo affect those institutions?
What was the last part of that question, Lily?
Does machismo affect those institutions?
Yeah, I think every gender. Realize I didn't put my microphone close enough here. Are you hearing me better now than you did a minute ago? Yes, my mistake. Yes, machismo. Both sexes tend to be territorial. After a divorce, one of the reasons we have the problems that we do of women fighting for the right to the children, rather than saying, oh, these are both our children. We have huge amounts of data for half a century now that children do much better with both sexes. Therefore, what can I do, husband, even though we're divorcing? You're the dad. How can I help you be involved? How can I let you know how much you're needed? How can I study books like The Boy Crisis to find out what you do differently and honor what you do differently and tell you why you're involved? But we don't have a word for like machismo for women to say why women don't take that attitude. Many women don't take that attitude, and the men end up having to only be able to be with the children if they are fighting for the children in many cases. Having said that, I have to also want to acknowledge that a lot of women do recognize the value of dads with their children, and that is not a problem. Those just aren't the women and men who get to court about that issue. So both sexes tend to feel that they know what they're doing in the area that they have been dominant in the past. And the mistake about that is enormous with bringing up children. When I did the research for The Boy Crisis, I found that the children who do best have what I call checks and balance parenting. They have a tension between mom's propensity to protect and dad's propensity to encourage risk-taking and to do things that help the children understand a lot of things like empathy. And we think of things like empathy as what the mother is more likely to give to a child. When in fact, if we one of the things I discovered as I did the research for The Boy Crisis is that empathy emanates. It's documented that empathy emanates from things like roughhousing, where the dad requires the child to think about their sister or the brother and pushing them too hard or pushing them out of the way in order to continue the roughhousing. And dad requires them to understand the difference between edging the brother or sister out or faking them out and pushing them out. That is, understand the difference between assertiveness and aggressiveness. And that creates social skills, and empathy creates children being much more likely to have friends in school, because everybody likes an empathetic friend more than a bully friend. And that dads do that through things like bonding with their children, and then using the bond that they've created with their children to create boundaries that they can enforce without alienating the children. Then that when they enforce the boundaries, they start teaching those children postponed gratification. And postponed gratification is the single biggest predictor of success or failure. By postponed gratification in that example, I mean the children want to push their brother or their sister out of the way so they can win in the roughhousing and maybe pin daddy down rather than daddy pinning the three of the children down. But they learn that if they do that pushing of their brother or sister around or making them cry, that the fear that the children start fearing that they won't get what they want, which is roughhousing. So they begin to learn postponed gratification, that is to postpone pushing their brother or sister aside in order to get the roughhousing to continue. And dads tend to be very good at boundary enforcement and very good at creating the bond that doesn't alienate the children when they do enforce the boundaries. And that becomes, as I said, the single biggest predictor of success. But I have never heard a dad say to a mom, sweetie, I'd like to roughhouse with the children because, I want to teach them empathy. And I want to teach them assertiveness to distinguish assertiveness and aggressiveness. And I want to be able to teach them how to finish their homework. Finish their homework from roughhousing? Yes, because of the boundary enforcement that allows them to have postponed gratification that doesn't allow them to get distracted so easily when a text comes in and says, why don't you come play the new video game with me? And so we find, so almost no dad says to mom, one of the reasons that children are only half as likely, 15% is likely to have ADHD when they're raised by a dad, and 30% likely to have ADHD when raised by a mom under similar socioeconomic backgrounds, is that the dad is far more likely to require that child to focus on what she or he needs to do in order to get what they want and have that postponed gratification. And that creates attention focus rather than attention deficit. But all of these things are not known. And I want to also acknowledge that dads, if you read parenting magazines and read most books on these issues, they explain mom's point of view. They don't explain dad's point of view either. So even if you were a dad that was gobbling up the literature is there. And I use the literature, I document the literature in the Boy Crisis book. The literature is there, but the popularization of that literature is not available.
Great, thank you. We'll just do one last question. This one is from Linda. She asks, would men speaking up improve the situation? We live in a consumer society which has prioritized the pursuit of pleasure at the cost of atomizing the family and the community.
Would you repeat that, Lillian?
She says, would men speaking up improve the situation? We currently live in a consumer society which has prioritized the pursuit of pleasure at the cost of atomizing the family and the community. So I think that's just like an aside context to her question.
Yes. The way we create change is groups speaking up. And dads have to get over the fact, or men have to get over the fact that many men need to learn that when they frame something, they have to frame it not as father's rights, but as children's rights. The children's right to both parents. Having said that, we need to speak up about that. And when we do speak, the way change occurs is by people speaking up, organizing, finding out who our allies are. If Janice Fiamengo wanted to run for office, I would do whatever I could to support her. And in England, people like Michael Buchanan and other people, Justice for Fathers for Justice, are beginning to speak up and run for parliament. And so these are the ways that people change. What I do is go out to Iowa every election cycle and talk to the Democratic candidates and talk to the Republican candidates. And I've been at the White House trying to brief the White House on the boy crisis, so that I don't just stop by writing a book. I try to take responsibility beyond writing the book to speak up and to organize and be part of the political process that creates change. And if you are a female or a male looking for purpose, one of the greatest things you can do for your children and the next generation is to encourage father involvement, to encourage governments to start father warrior programs, to allow men to think of themselves as having purpose and being warriors by overcoming the barriers to being a full-time dad or a significantly involved dad. and for allowing men to feel honored by loving and being loved rather than killing and being killed. That's what would begin to change the world in a very meaningful way for generation after generation.
Thank you, Dr. Farrell. I really liked your portion of the talk. Especially after reading your book, it cleared a lot of things up for me. Thank you so much.
I'm so glad. I really honor you for reading The Boy Crisis and especially to talking with your dad about it. Would you be good enough to send me a copy of the session that you and Janice do so that I can listen to that? I'm now caught in the quandary of sharing the responsibility for cooking dinner with my wife and listening, but I'd love to listen to it later, probably tomorrow.
Yeah, I'll send you the YouTube link. It'll be recorded.
Oh, great. I look forward to that. Janice, I really look forward to let's arrange a phone call and connect.
I'd love to, and really enjoyed listening to you, Warren, as always.
Thank you very much. And I feel the same way about you, as I hope you are aware.
Thank you.
Thanks again for coming. Take care.
Thank you. Thank you for organizing this, and especially for getting students to deviate from political correctness.
Of course.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Okay. So we'll now move on to the next segment of our talk, which is with Professor Janice Fiamengo. Thank you for coming, Janice.
Thank you very much for inviting me. This is a subject that really interests me.
Good. Yeah, I can tell. So just a quick introduction. Janice Fiamengo is a retired English professor from the University of Ottawa, and she has authored books including Sons of Feminism, which we have right here, Sons of Feminism, Men Have Their Say, as well as The Woman's Page, Journalism and Rhetoric in Early Canada. Janice has long advocated for equality among men and women, especially in matters such as divorce and suicide prevention. UBC SFE has taken a special interest in Dr. Fiamengo, as her views have been a source of controversy in the recent past. So thank you for coming.
Well, thank you for inviting me. And geez, it's hard to go after Dr. Farrell. He's such a fount of knowledge, and he's been, in the trenches, dedicating his life to making changes in the status of men and helping women, especially to understand the significance of fathers and the many struggles that men have and aren't able to articulate very well. I'm going to sort of approach the subject from a much more narrowly academic perspective. That was my experience. I spent many years studying feminist theory when I was a PhD student. I read feminist theory for years, and I was very interested in different branches of feminist theory and the struggles between feminists, the power struggles within feminism. So that's going to be sort of my perspective today. And I was especially, before I get into it, I did write out a talk. I know it's not as interesting to listen to someone read a talk. I'm going to try to talk it, but you'll see that I'm reading my notes as well. But the thing that has been sort of niggling at me ever since May of this year, after the Central Park incident that involved a woman named Amy Cooper. Do you know this incident, Lillian? Yeah, I guess everybody does. The Central Park incident in New York City involving Amy Cooper, who was a woman with her dog, and she was asked by a man whose name was Christian Cooper, no relation, to leash her dog. And they had back and forth, and she threatened at that, because she refused to leash her dog, she threatened to report Christian Cooper to the police, saying that he was attacking her. And she did actually phone the police, and he began filming her with his camera. He was Black, she was white, and he caught the incident of her obviously false allegation. She claimed that he was attacking her, that an African-American man was attacking her, and he clearly was not attacking her. And his filming of her went viral, and it quickly became, it became an occasion to discuss the racism of white women. And shortly after that, or around that time, I mean, and that was the same weekend in late May of 2020 that George Floyd was killed in that unfortunate encounter with the police. And so race issues were foregrounded very pointedly at that point. And at the same time, there was just an explosion of discussion about Karens. And you could see trending on Twitter day after day, hashtags like Karens Gone Wild, with people filming women, exclusively, I think, white women, filming women acting badly, being arrogant, being bossy, demanding to see, the manager to complain about something, cursing somebody out for some transgression, and sometimes behaving in racist ways. And Karen became a kind of shorthand for arrogant white women, and particularly racist and arrogant white women who did not acknowledge their privilege as white women, and who exercised their privilege to make the lives of less powerful people, perhaps particularly Black men, to make their lives miserable. And it was a really interesting moment to me, because it made me think that in a way what we were witnessing was the moral authority of white women being challenged, and perhaps even being completely destroyed in that moment. There were all sorts of incidents where white women over the summer were called out for their alleged racism, their alleged lack of awareness of their own race and other privilege. So it made me think a lot about the sort of precarious position of white women within feminism. And I think what I'm going to try to argue in my presentation is that the idea of the woke white woman, the woman who speaks on behalf of the oppressed, is in many ways the typical response of white feminists to their uneasy position at the intersection of race and gender ideologies. At least that's what I'm going to argue. And I know, I should say right off the bat that I'm making lots of generalizations here. I'm generalizing about white feminist women in particular, and I recognize that what I'm saying here doesn't apply to every particular white feminist woman. So the question that I'm trying to answer then is, why have white women been at the forefront of woke culture? And my answer in a nutshell is that white feminist women created a victim ideology that served them quite well for a time. It was never totally unchallenged, but in the 1960s and 1970s, it served them well. And that in order to maintain that ideology as it came under increasing attack in the 1980s and early 1990s, they found themselves pushed into ever more rigid adherence to a complex feminist orthodoxy. So that's kind of my thesis statement. So maybe I should back up a little bit first by saying that by feminist, I mean women who believe, as feminists articulated it in the 1960s and 1970s, that the experience of women in Western culture was the experience of living in a patriarchy. In other words, a system that was created by men to advantage other men at the expense of women. Now that got refined over time so that the men who had created the system were seen increasingly as not just all men, powerful white men. And the idea was that the system that those powerful white heterosexual able-bodied men had created it was maintained at women's expense through violence, through threats of violence, and through other mechanisms of control, such as systemic sexism and propaganda and social conditioning. That's a very simplistic outline of feminism, but I think it's generally accurate, although there are many different forms of feminism. So feminist white women today are in a peculiar position because they are, of necessity, radically conscious of themselves as occupying a position at the intersection of what they would call race and gender hierarchies. And in the gender hierarchy, white women are victims, and they have the moral authority and the social power that comes with being seen as victims and having positioned themselves very successfully as victims. But within the race hierarchy, they have no moral authority because they are not seen as victims. They are seen as having privilege and being complicit in racial oppression. And so because of this complex positioning at the intersection of these two very highly powerful ideologies, which have been jostling for preeminence in our culture for many years, white women need to conform with ever more subtle awareness of the dictates of intersectional feminist ideology in order to maintain their identity as proponents of equality. So that's kind of the argument overall. Now, I need to back up a bit to explain all of this. When I speak of feminist gender ideology, I'm speaking of a theory that works really to, I think, reduce the deep complexity of human experience into a number of fairly simple binary oppositions. So you have the oppressor and the oppressed, you have the victimizer and the victim, and you have the person who has privilege versus the person who is powerless and subjugated. And so this is essentially gender victim ideology in its simplest outline. Now, you might ask, why would anyone want to believe that women's experience in Western culture, or indeed in any culture, but we're speaking of white women in Western culture, why would anyone want to believe in that kind of a schema, that men have all the power, that women are powerless, that men have brutalized women and women have been brutalized victims? In many ways, it on the face of it, it seems like a view of the world that would produce a sense of hopelessness, that it would create resentment and just a lot of rage. And indeed, if you read a lot of feminist writings, you see that rage and you see that resentment pretty clearly on display. But that victim ideology also produces a very powerful sense of righteousness, of being a righteous victim, an innocent victim. And that feeling is extremely pleasurable. Only I think somebody who has experienced it can really understand how deeply pleasurable it can be. Even, one might say, exhilarating. Even, one might say, quite addictive, especially if that becomes sort of the ground of one's moral identity, as it does for some feminists. And I'm talking here, when I speak of feminists, I'm not talking about what one might call coffee shop feminists, just people who say, oh yeah, I'm for equality, of course. I'm talking about feminists who have read deeply in feminist theory and who believe very passionately in this notion of the world as divided up in these binary categories of victimizer and victim. And the thing about victim status that is, well, there are a number of reasons why I think it's so pleasurable, even addictive and exhilarating. Victim status in our culture, not in all cultures, but in our time and place, confers authenticity. It confers moral innocence. It confers the ability to speak with authority and to have people listen with respect. It also confers an aura of courage. You know, we speak of women often as survivors, and there's a kind of valiant idea to that, that they're speaking out against oppression, and this is something that takes great courage, and people admire those who speak out about their wrong treatment. I think it's fair to say also that victim ideology, gender victim ideology in particular, offers a fairly reliable form of exemption from personal responsibility for any failing or inadequacy in one's life. So that anything that one feels unhappy about, whether it is unhappiness with one's physical appearance, or unhappiness with one's career, or a recognition that one has failed as a mother or as a partner or as a friend, all of those can, to some extent, be explained away by being blamed on an external, source of victimization. So you can talk about our culture's unrealistic expectations of women. You can talk about sexist double standards. You can refer to the patriarchy. So all sources of dissatisfaction, therefore, can be blamed on this external force, and they're not within one's own control. They're not one's own responsibility. That can be very freeing, even though I think it's morally problematic, very limiting in many ways. And what happens under feminism is that many sources of dissatisfaction or unhappiness, rather than simply being accepted as the ordinary facts of life, something that everybody experienced, rather than simply being accepted in that way, they are remembered and magnified and stored up in one's consciousness as evidence of this thing, patriarchal oppression. And that whole ideology provides a very strong source of meaning and indeed comfort in everyday life. It provides a rationale, an explanation, a sense of purpose. It can become very important to one's personal identity, and it provides this feeling of righteousness that can be indeed very satisfying. So that's, I think, part of what makes this ideology so powerful. Now, not all feminists at the beginning of the second wave, and I'm talking about the feminism that developed in the late 1960s and 70s, not all those feminists were white women, but the majority of them were. And early feminist theory is almost entirely focused on gender. I don't know if anybody's interested in this, but if somebody wants to ask me about it, I can go into more detail. But it's quite interesting to read early feminists like Gloria Steinem in her earliest writing, Kate Millett, Susan Brown Miller. They were absolutely convinced that gender oppression was a source of sisterhood, that it transcended all other differences between women. Gloria Steinem, in an essay called Sisterhood, talks about how women's sense of shared oppression as women transcends all differences, including differences of race. Kate Millett thought that racism as an ideology, this was in her book, Sexual Politics, she thought that racism as an ideology was dying out. This was in 1970. She felt that gender oppression, sex oppression, was the by far most powerful form of oppression. And so these women accepted the idea of all women being united through their shared oppression as a self-evident truth. But this big problem began to develop for these white feminists as that very powerful feeling, that exhilarating sense of themselves as righteous victims, this began to be challenged over the course of time. And it was challenged beginning in the late 1980s or mid to late 1980s by women who had other sorts of identities, particularly by lesbian women, by women of color, by indigenous women, by women who had disabilities. And these women challenged heterosexual, able-bodied white women and, said to them, look, our suffering is far more intense than yours. We experience multiple forms of oppression. We find ourselves at the bottom of a number of hierarchies. And so that the idea that white women were these righteous victims was challenged by these other women. But even more significantly than that, these other women were able to claim, and quite convincingly, that white heterosexual cisgender women were actually participants in the oppression of these various other women because they were complicit in the exact same way that white feminists said that men were complicit. All men were complicit in the oppression of women. The part of the theory of patriarchy was that all men benefit from the oppression of women, not just some men. And so according to that binary logic, all white women then necessarily were, complicit and benefited from white supremacism, just as all heterosexual women benefited from and were complicit in homophobia and heterosexist oppression and so on. And this idea couldn't be challenged because it operated according to that same binary logic that had made feminist claims about men and women so very powerful and difficult to argue against. So these accusations that began to be made in the mid-1980s were very damaging to white feminists' understanding of themselves and their sense of moral authority. And essentially, their moral innocence was shattered. They according to these claims, these accusations, especially of racism made by Black feminists and other feminists of color, these accusations of racism really made white women little better than white men. And so this was a very profound threat to their self-identity. It had to be defended against in some way. And the way it ended up being defended against, to put it very simply, it was essentially defended against by white women acknowledging their privilege, confessing it, explicitly making public acknowledgement of that, especially their white privilege, also their able-bodied and heterosexual privilege, etc., but making acknowledgement of it and then committing themselves to fight against the enemy. And the enemy became white, heteropatriarchal, able-bodied male villainy. Committing to become victim advocates was the manner in which white feminists secured their moral exemption from the charge of complicity in racism and other isms. That was the only way they could maintain their moral authority. So I think that, in a way, I'm truncating a lot of developments, but it brings us to this point in which white feminists understand the precariousness of their position as advocates for social justice. When they're dealing with white men, they have the automatic moral authority. But when they're dealing with others, Black women, sometimes Black men, various others who identify themselves as more oppressed, white feminists must acknowledge their privilege in relation to those others and have to be quite deferential to those others' claim to different types of victimization, and therefore the authority to speak about race and other kinds of issues. And it leads into, it became the theory of intersectional feminism, which gained dominance in the early 1990s, I would say, when various feminist theorists like Bell Hooks, for instance, and Kimberly Crenshaw, who I think is credited with actually inventing the phrase intersectional feminism, and various others. Shireen Razak is another, Angela Davis. So that was sort of third wave feminism, intersectional feminism, and it involves these quite complex gradations of victim status, which are often shifting and contested. And white feminists need to be very, very conscious of these various gradations. And it sometimes involves them in quite a bit of strain or contradiction in their ideology. For instance, you might find that a group of white feminists will one day march in a slut walk in which they, rail against patriarchal standards, and they may rip off their tops and go bare-breasted. They may even strip down completely naked, as I've seen in some videos, and have things written all over their body, claiming their right to be sluts. And then on another day, they may don a hijab and march in solidarity with Muslim women. But interestingly enough, you will never find white feminists trying to shame or cajole Muslim women into themselves stripping down naked and marching in the slut walk, because of that variously complex victim hierarchy. They pay greater deference to Muslim women because, according to this complex victim schema, Islam is othered within the white Western patriarchal system, and therefore Muslim women have a different kind of victim status than white Western women do, and that has to be acknowledged. And so it creates a lot of interesting contradictions and juggling of awareness of various sorts of victim positions. But what is more, I think what I came to realize as I studied this issue more and more deeply was that often the issue is not really the issue. And often the issue is not actually the real well-being of women. It is about maintaining the white feminist's status as a moral authority. And that involves always keeping the source of anger as against the white, Western, colonialist, imperialist, capitalist patriarchy. So always everything is calibrated according to what allows the white feminist to maintain her status as the advocate arguing against the villainy of white, Western, capitalist, imperialist patriarchy. And so when to finish off, when the Central Park incident occurred involving Amy Cooper, who became known, of course, as the Central Park Karen, that was seen as an obvious instance of white women's racism. And I thought it was quite interesting that rather than becoming the occasion for a discussion about women's power in general to accuse men, it became a discussion about white women's racism and white women's accusations against Black men. The unspoken assumption seemed to be that if the man who had asked Amy to leash her dog. If he had been a white man, I don't know that she wouldn't have accused him, or that if she had accused him, she wouldn't have been believed, which is absolutely not true. White women make accusations against white men all the time. Women of color make accusations against white men all the time and are believed. But that the gender dynamic seemed to fall away there, and it became about race. And I kept wondering if Christian Cooper had been a white man, and if he had similarly recorded what happened that day and had posted the recording. I really wondered whether whether there would have been such a universality of response in his favor and against her. I suspect that white feminists, who I think were pretty much united in denouncing Amy Cooper as a racist white woman, I suspect that if the man she had falsely accused had been a white man, that the reaction would have been quite different. I think sympathy for the white man would have been probably quite a bit less. I think people would have been interested in why he was, filming her. He did say something mildly threatening right before he began filming her. He said, if you're not going to leash your dog, I'm going to do something you're not going to like. And he seemed to be tempting her dog with some dog treats or something like that. And I mean, he wasn't entirely innocent in the entire affair. Not that she was right to accuse him. But I think if he had been white, sympathy for him would have been lessened. And I think sympathy for Amy Cooper in that case would probably have been heightened, that white feminists would have been a lot more empathetic, would have talked about the legitimate reasons for her fear, and would have been a lot more creative in finding ways to side with her against the man in that case. So I guess to finish up then, I would say that some observers speculated that the anger at Amy Cooper and then the general anger at Karens, all the denunciations of Karens, that was a useful development in our public conversation, because maybe it would lead to a rethinking of female power, especially female power over less powerful men. I'm doubtful about that. I mean, that remains to be seen. And my argument would be that white women have had a precarious position in the hierarchy of oppression and privilege for a long time in the academy. And that what we're seeing now with the idea of the Karen and indeed the woke white woman, what we're seeing is really a kind of mainstreaming of this complex intersectional victim hierarchy, which may advantage some women, non-white women, but I doubt will actually advantage any men at all. But certainly I think the Karen phenomenon illustrates the very volatile nature of victim politics and the way in which competition for victim status is ongoing, and new categories of oppression and privilege, new categories of wokeness or lack thereof are continually being discovered and mobilized for people's particular personal ends. So I would say that the era of the white woman's moral authority has been challenged very decisively. It's not necessarily over, but it's definitely under sustained attack in this moment. That's it.
Yeah, thanks for that. That was very interesting. We'll open it up to some questions now. We had one quite persistent question here. Corky Day asks, should women just give up on trying to attain political equality?
Well, that's a very large question, interesting question. What does political equality mean? Dr. Farrell talked about all of the ways in which women in general, as women, are actually privileged in relation to men, and arguably have far more social power than men have. He talked about the draft and the fact that men in the United States, when they reach the age of majority, have to register for the draft in case, well, they have to register in the selective service system in case there is a draft in a time of war. I think it's fair to say that although we don't have such a thing in Canada, it's still largely understood that if, God forbid, there were a war in which people had to be drafted, that it would be men who would be drafted. I don't think that there is the stomach in our culture for the prospect of women coming home in body bags by the hundreds. I think it's generally still accepted that if someone has to be sacrificed, it will have to be the men, not the women. Is that the kind of political equality women are determined to have? Some women would say, yeah, sure, women should be drafted. There's all sorts of other complex problems to do with that, because women simply don't have the physical strength, and studies that have been done in military combat situations have shown that all male military teams are far more effective as fighting units than mixed squads, and that women suffer many more injuries during combat, both psychological and physical. So what does equality mean in a context where women simply do not have the physical strength overall? I mean, some individual women do, but overall women are not as strong as men. And where women are, that we simply have more empathy in our culture for women's suffering. I think both men and women care more about women than they do about men. And there are all sorts of areas in which men are falling behind women or suffer in different ways from women. If you look at the homeless, if you're driving in East Hastings or in some poor neighborhood in Vancouver, and you see the homeless sitting out on the street, the vast majority of those are men. And that's there may be complex reasons for that, but it's partly that I don't think we could stomach seeing women sitting out homeless. We create shelters for women and their children. I've known men who were in abusive domestic situations, and they tried to escape from an abusive wife or female partner, and they phoned around, and there were no shelters for men. We have hundreds of shelters supported by taxpayer money all across Canada. I don't think there's a single one that admits men. So, there are all sorts of ways in which we could say that men suffer in ways that women don't. It just depends on how one defines political equality.
I agree.
It's a great question. I mean, we could spend the whole rest of the time talking about that, but
it is kind of broad. Let's see.
Good question.
There is an interesting one again from Linda. She says, why was Amy Cooper treated in the media as a white woman without qualification and not as a white Jewish woman?
Oh, I didn't even know that she was a Jewish
woman. Me neither until right now.
I don't know. Yeah, I mean, I'm not sure. I mean, I guess I would say that I think that for various reasons, probably especially because that same weekend saw the death of George Floyd and the very powerful reaction that prompted, when it comes to race, especially in the United States, probably in Canada too, the moral power of Black victimhood is extremely strong. And the direction in which animus against the oppressor group. In the case of Black victimhood, the direction in which that goes is very much towards white people. And so that's it's a dynamic that everybody is familiar with. It has a great deal of resonance in our culture. And so I think it fit that situation perfectly. This is not to say that anti-Semitism doesn't exist in our culture. It certainly does, but it plays in very complex ways when it comes to white-Black dynamics. So I think it's a lot simpler to look at that interaction in those terms, probably. It's a good question. I never thought of it. I didn't know about that.
Yeah, interesting. Let's see. Next question. Okay, somebody on Facebook asks, I'm not sure about the statistics behind this, but many white women are coming out as lesbian or transgender, many more than in the past. Could this be a bid to acquire more intersectional oppression?
Intersectional oppression points. Well, that would be a very cynical way of looking at it. But I think my whole talk maybe could be accused of being a little bit cynical when it comes to the way in which people seek out a victim identity. And so, yes, I would have to say that I think once one has had a taste of the amazingly powerful rush of being a victim, it's hard to give it up. And so I think the temptation to identify as something even more oppressed or victimized than simply being female, I think the temptation is quite strong. I mean, I wouldn't want to callously dismiss people's, genuine sense of who they are. I think a lot of people certainly are not consciously aware that what they're doing is seeking out a victim identity. But I do think that it is very, very strong in certain circles, in university circles, and in other elite circles, in woke communities. The power of being able to silence a room with one's victim story, and indeed to some extent to have one's own interpretation of an experience dominate over another's. And what you can do, if you can claim greater victimization, greater victim status, your interpretation trumps the other person's interpretation almost solely by virtue of the fact that you occupy a different niche in the victim hierarchy. It's hard not to seek that out. So I'd have to agree that there's an element of that in the claiming of a lesbian or a transgender or a queer identity.
Okay, thank you. We'll move on to the next question. This one's from Yash. He says, what do you think needs to happen to shift the conversation from racism to power of women's word over men's word?
Well, it's a hard one. That is a really difficult one, again, because I think we as a culture, we just tend to feel a lot more empathy and compassion for women. So if a woman accuses a man of doing something terrible, we tend to believe her. I don't think there is personally, I don't think there's a very strong racial element in that. Yes, there is a history in North America, particularly in the United States, of white women accusing Black men of rape. And in the early years of the 20th century, for example, Black men were lynched, were murdered on the word of white women, and that's simply a fact, and that can't be dismissed. But in our present day, I haven't found that race really makes that much difference. There's a famous case. I don't know if anybody listening knows of it, but a couple of years ago, a British man, white man, named Mark Pearson was walking through the Waterloo station, subway station in London. And he discovered later that a South Asian woman, and actually a very an elite woman, an actress, she accused him of having sexually assaulted her in the subway. And it was a bizarre accusation. There was actually CCTV footage of him passing her in a crowded subway. And he passed her, in the way that you pass anybody in about 1 second, maybe 2 seconds in total. He was carrying a newspaper in one hand and an umbrella in the other hand. Like, it was literally impossible that he could have done to her what she claimed he did. She claimed he assaulted her, sexually assaulted her with his fingers. And it obviously didn't happen. And yet her word was taken so seriously that the Crown Prosecution Service had him, the police arrested him, and then the Crown Prosecution Service took up the charge, and he went to trial, and it went all the way through the trial. Luckily, he was acquitted at the end of it. But, he had I'm not sure exactly how long it took for the claim to wind its way through the police and court system, but probably 2 years or something like that. He had the hell of worrying about whether he was going to be imprisoned on this utterly ludicrous charge for which there was actual evidence that he couldn't possibly have done it. But that partly was a result of very effective feminist lobbying of the Crown Prosecution Service to increase its rate of convictions of rape claims. And every office of prosecution in every Western nation, certainly in the whole Anglosphere, is feeling that. The police service is feeling it. Prosecutors are definitely feeling it. Pressure from feminists and from the general public to convict more men accused of sexual assault and rape. And it's a huge, huge problem. Feminists become very angry when one talks about it and say that actually the number of, false accusations is very low. They use a number like 2 to 8%. Although I have to say that if it's 8%, that's pretty darn high. But that's actually just the number that we know are false. The number of accusations in which the woman recanted, or in which, it was actually proved in some way that it was a false accusation. Many, many more accusations are never proved false. We don't know the actual number. It could be quite high. It's very easy to make a false accusation, and quite unlikely in our present culture that police have the appetite to pursue a woman criminally for making a false charge. So I don't know what the answer is. The lack of empathy in general for men who are accused of hideous sexual crimes. The lack of empathy is startling, and I don't know how to dislodge it, really.
Yeah, that's troubling. I didn't know about that case. That's scary, that without any evidence, 2 years of his life.
Yeah, I mean, it is awful. And there are many cases. I've been particularly interested in cases where men at college have been accused. I think you could say there's something of an epidemic of false accusations on college campuses. And, in those cases, often the young man faces maybe not prison in the sense that often this is a case that's handled by a college tribunal. But he certainly faces the total ruination of his reputation and the complete smashing of his career dreams. He often ends up kicked out of school. with his standing, just completely in tatters, with everyone hating him, thinking that he did some horrible thing to a young woman. And there's, this has been going on for quite a long time. And I think there's still a very strong sense of sympathy for women. There's a strong belief that women are under threat on college campuses. And that if some men's lives are ruined through a false accusation, that's a relatively small price to pay for making women in general safer and making it more possible for them to come forward to tell what has happened to them. So it's very difficult, I think, to get people to care about what happens to men.
Yeah. Nicholas, did you have a question for Professor Fiamengo?
Oh, sure. A follow-up?
Yeah. Now that she's given her talk.
Yeah, totally.
So you had mentioned earlier that the change of white women being a protected class that emerged in the late 80s and 90s, where their alleged racism came to the front. I'm wondering if there's any correlation between, why is it emerging now? Like during the pandemic, the terms Karen and the association of woke culture with white women, why is that coming to a head now of all times? If this had originated in the early 90s or 90s, why is this coming? Why is this coming now?
I don't know. That's a very good question. Oh, sorry, I didn't hear the rest.
And how has COVID influenced that change?
That is a great question. And I have not thought about it at all, really. Unless one wants to take a conspiratorial kind of attitude to COVID and the reaction that our leaders have had to it, which in a way I'm quite willing to take, given that, we just saw our Prime Minister speaking to the United Nations and talking about reset and, the opportunity to make radical changes, to reimagine economic systems, to work to end inequities, both within countries and between countries. He used all the kind of buzzwords that we're familiar with in discussions of the authoritarian takeover of our culture in order to remake it in a kind of socialist utopian model in which we will own nothing and will be happy, and in which our leaders will make decisions for the good of all, and we will lose our liberty, but we'll be more secure and more we'll be looked after in some way according to their wisdom. Now, if one believes that is happening now, which I do to a certain degree, it makes sense to see that any opportunity to destabilize the populace, to turn people against one another, and to whip up grievance that can then be mobilized, grievances and hatreds and disunity and suspicion and everything else. It makes sense that powerful forces might be interested in doing that. I mean, I think it has been happening for a time, but it has mainly been confined to academia. And I've been observing it in academia for a long time, the diminishment of white women's moral authority and this power struggle going on within feminism. But yeah, it certainly did explode onto the scene this year. And explanation, one could simply say that tensions are high during a lot of people are feeling extremely anxious, partly as a result of the media and governments whipping up fear in order to ensure compliance with their directives and perhaps to create a very willing market for a vaccine. So certainly people are extremely anxious, and that's a perfect time for people to be encouraged to hate one another and to start thinking about all the ways that all the ways we're different and all the ways it's impossible to get along, rather than to feel a sense of common identity as citizens of a country, or as just fellow human beings.
On the topic of COVID, do you believe that white women have been attributed with the political stance of anti-mask in the same way that they have been attributed the anti-black racism?
Well, I certainly have seen that. Yeah, on Twitter, I have seen that. The idea. I mean, there aren't very many people who are anti-mask these days. The vast majority of people seem to have their resistance has crumbled, it seems. But I had seen that earlier, especially when the Karen meme really exploded. The idea of the selfish woman, the sort of overly self-confident, bossy, arrogant woman who didn't care about others. And that that was part and parcel of the accusation that people who were skeptical about the efficacy of masks were selfish and wanted people to die. So I definitely did see the Karen meme used for those people as well. But I also saw, I have to say, I also saw a lot of articles saying that white men were the main culprits. That especially older white men who are used to, they're risk takers. They tend to be less willing to conform than others. I saw a number of articles blaming white men for failing to get with the program of masking.
Nice. Thank you.
Okay. I think we'll maybe just do one or two more questions. Let's see here. This is a good one. So somebody in chat asks, why is men's rights activism so consistently a pipeline to right-wing extremism, such as anti-feminism, pickup artists, and incels?
Well, I can't answer that question because I don't accept its premise. I think that's a smear on the part of those who, the intersectional feminist media that want you to be turned off by the idea of men's rights activism. And one of the many ways, there's all sorts of ways that one can be turned off from taking seriously what men's rights activists have to say. One of the ways is by saying that they're all, right-wing extremists. It simply is not the case. I don't know any men's rights advocates who are right-wing extremists or white supremacists or any of the things that they're alleged to be. Many men's issues advocates are not particularly political at all. Many of them come to men's issues because they've had an incredibly horrific divorce where they've lost everything that they spent their life working for, and no longer are able to see their children because their ex-wife has alienated their children from them, told their children lies, told lies to the judge during the divorce process, claiming that they were abusive. There's all sorts of horrific stories out there. And so many of these men aren't the least bit political. They just realized as a result of these horrific experiences that our system, especially the family law system, is completely stacked against men, and that believes deeply in the idea that men are always perpetrators of violence and women are always innocent victims. So yeah, I would encourage that person to take a look at the variety of people who are involved in advocacy for men's rights, and to recognize that it's politically quite diverse, and I would say not at all extremist in that way. unless it's me. But
I don't know. That's a question that we get a lot. So thank you. Let's see here. Can you speak on the effects of social media such as Twitter and Facebook on the increasingly toxic white women / Karen mentality?
The mentality? Well, I mean, I'm not quite sure what the question is asking, but I'll take a stab at it. I mean, I don't actually really believe in the Karen. I think there are unpleasant white women. There are unpleasant Black women, and there are unpleasant people of all stripes and persuasions. I don't think that white women in particular are enormously that way. I think it is actually that's a discourse or a stereotype that has been created in order to challenge white women's presumed moral authority. Just like years ago, the idea of the deadbeat dad circulated in popular culture. The idea that there were a whole bunch of men who had abandoned their families and refused to pay child support. Many decades later, I mean, this was just accepted, and probably still is accepted now by people, that there were a lot of men like that who didn't care about their children and just refused to pay child support out of apathy and indifference. It was, people have researched that and found that the men who didn't pay constituted a tiny, tiny proportion of all divorced fathers who were, made to pay child support. That many men worked themselves into absolute penury in an attempt to pay their child support, which was often very unreasonable. And, that many of them, the vast majority deeply cared about making sure that their children were well looked after, even if they couldn't see those children. So I sort of, in a way, I think I see the Karen meme in a similar way. I think it's a cultural attack on a particular type of person that really should be given no more credence, I don't think, than any caricatures or any stereotypes based on race and sex or sexual orientation or whatever it happens to be. I do think that in general, women our culture has not done women any favors by inculcating in women generally, not just white women, the idea that simply by being women, they're very important. And, that everything they do should be applauded, or I guess I should say everything we do, that as women, wow, we're just wonderful. We're bold, we're brave. We should be encouraged in everything. If we fail, it's always because of, something beyond our control, such as sexism, that we are owed something by our societies, that we have been heroic overcomers, and, that we should be celebrated every step of the way. I think that has produced in women generally a kind of lack of moral accountability, a lack of a sense of responsibility, probably pride, a puffed up sense of our own importance. But I don't think that is necessarily tied to race or any other variable. I would see it as a product in general of feminism. And I would say that, Black women and brown women are at least as guilty as white women of that sense of being a member of the elect, that sense of having some kind of moral superiority simply because we're all women. So to that extent, I'm not sure. I would say certainly that Twitter and Facebook and everything encourages the most vicious responses, the piling on, the witch hunting, the mobbing of people. It's if you ever want to have your faith in humanity dashed, You just have to go and watch a mobbing taking place and see the happy piling on of people of all races and both sexes.
Okay, we'll do one final question because we're running out of time here. So I've seen online a lot of your criticisms from people, and I get criticisms similar to this, are that you have internalized misogyny and you're a self-hating woman. What do you say to combat these accusations?
I don't think they can be combated because they're completely irrational and they're not, based on any objective evidence that one could argue with. I think if you look at the arguments that I make, and I've tried to make rational evidence-based arguments whenever I can, certainly in all my videos, I'm very careful not to simply fling around accusations or statements, but to argue from evidence. It doesn't matter. I mean, maybe I am self-hating. I don't know. I mean, only a psychologist could say. And if I am self-hating, I probably wouldn't know it, right? Because that would be, if it's internalized, I would have repressed it. So I couldn't possibly say, and neither could anybody else. I'm not interested in attacking any individual women. My arguments are with feminist ideology and the impact that it's had on public policy and on law, and the ways in which men are pretty evidently disadvantaged under that policy and that law. And I've always tried to look at the very specific ways that that feminist ideology has created injustice. So I think the arguments should be combated on their own. If I'm wrong in the statistics that I'm using, or if I'm wrong in the argument that I've created, then I would welcome anybody to show in what ways I'm wrong. But to simply attack me as a person, I wouldn't even try to defend myself, and I don't find that a very compelling criticism.
Well, Janice, thank you so much for your time. I really appreciate your involvement in our event, and I loved what you had to say. So thank you. And
thank you. I really enjoyed it, and I appreciated the chance to try out that idea, because I have been thinking about it all summer. So thanks a lot.
Thank you. Take care. Have a good night.
Take care. Bye-bye.